Welcome to video 4, the Apache web server part. We're now here. We've just finished our Docker setup, which we've now got a Docker Compose script created, which sets up a Postgres database container and a Flow container, both of which have been set up. The Docker Compose has been uploaded to our EC2 instance. We can then run that. That creates the two containers on the machine. We can see the logs running for those, and we have good connections, and they're both up and running. So we're at the point now where we move on to our local runtime HTML server setup. So this now requires the use, if you ever look through the documentation, it says it requires the use of a web server. And as you can see down here, a containerized web server can be used, such as the Apache web server. So I have used that, and I used the official HTTPD container here, which the documentation uses. So I've used this, and we're going to create our Apache container. So we have a look what's running. We've got our two containers that are running currently. There's our Flow container, there's our Postgres container. I currently have a HTTPD container that's installed, but it's one I've run some time ago. So what we can do, you could do a Docker pull latest. So let's do a sudo docker. So let's pull the latest HTTPD down. So I'm going to run the Apache Docker container as the official notes suggest. If you have a look through, you can, I'm using the same ones, but what I'm gonna do basically is I'm gonna run it against 8181 because I've got the Flow Docker container against 8080. So that's really the only change I've really made to this. So I'm gonna run this side by side. So in the end, I'll have 3 Docker containers up and running. Okay, well, I've already got one running. So what a container that's already there with it. So let's get rid of that one. And now we'll create a new one. Okay. And actually it's run as well. So that's it running. So now we've got our web server Apache container up and running. We've got our Flow latest up and running, and we've got our Postgres latest up and running. So the Apache logs just tell us that resuming normal operation is all okay. If you want to get into the container to have a look at what's going on, or you might need to see where the location of the files are for the Apache side, then you can exec into the container. So and So now we are in the container itself, and we can have a look at, if you need to have a look at anything. The interesting thing that here is you may need to have a look at the htdocs, because I think that's the location of where the default player page needs to go to. And the htdocs is set to my home location. So the container is looking directly into my home location. That is where my default HTML is going to come into this. So let's get out of that container. Let's have a look where we are, or in the admin. And you can see here that mimics where the htdocs were going to go. Okay, so we have our Apache container up and running now. Let's just double check that. So we now have our Boomi container on latest. We have our Postgres container on latest, and we have our Apache container up and running. The Apache container is running on 8181 internal 80, and then our Boomi container is on 8080 internal 80, external 80. So right, so we're going to be hitting 8181 in this case. So the next part of what we're going to do is we're going to create our player. We're going to use the default legacy runtime player, as the documentation suggests here. So we're going to create a default player. The way to do this is through the players section, go to the default legacy, copy the content of that. What I'm doing here is I'm creating, again, what I've done in the past with my Docker Compose. I'm creating a file on my system, and I'm going to use FileZilla to just upload that. So I've created a file in my folder called default.html. So the documentation asks here for it to be called new default.html file. I've grabbed the default legacy code, and I've put that as default into my default.html, which is this. And it's going to then ask us to make some changes to this. So the first change is on the initialize section. So it's asking us there to change the IP address. So I've added that as my public IP address on port 80 internal. And then the next part is you can then add the tenant ID in here. So the tenant ID, which I copied earlier, my tenant being this one, I need to change that. On my default player. So there we are. I can change the tenant over to there and save that. This creates, so I've created this as a default.html on my machine, so I can make changes. I can see it in color and stuff like that. I find it easier. You do this how you want to do this, but this is just the way I do. So that was my Docker Compose. My default HTML is there. So what we're going to do is upload this now to our default location. Let's double check it's there. And we can see we've got our default HTML, we've got our Docker Compose file. So we're ready to go. The container's up and running, and we've got so we've now finished our section on our setting up of our default HTML page. Moving on to our next video in a second. Flow run URL.